We here at WKAR exist to serve Mid-Michigan with trusted journalism and local programming. Federal funding has been eliminated, which means community support is critical to sustaining this service and helping WKAR meet evolving community needs. Your ongoing support ensures public media remains freely available and locally focused. Become a sustaining member or upgrade your current gift today. Sustain what matters. Build what's next.
Another huge news week in our town. No August vote on giving the governor power to appoint members of the MSU board and elsewhere, and a debrief on what happened on Mackinac Island last week. So sit in with us as we get the inside out. Off the record.
Production of Off the Record is made possible in part by Bellwether Public Relations, a full-service strategic communications agency partnering with clients through public relations, digital marketing, and issue advocacy. Learn more at bellwetherpr.com. And now, this edition of Off the Record with Tim Skubic.
Welcome back to Studio C on a busy news week. Let's start with the obvious one, Beth. The lead out of the Michigan House this week, they tried to put on the August ballot, giving the governor power to appoint the boards at MSU and the other two. Que pasa?
Well, so these resolution, the resolution that they voted on was introduced like a week and a half ago. At that point, it included not just the boards, but also the AG and SOS and some different details about the board appointment system. By the time it got to the House floor, it had been changed significantly. It was only the university boards. They were strict mandates about how those folks are appointed. Democrats said they were given no warning. And what you saw was a resolution that was supposed to get 2/3 support that could not even get a majority support. And it wasn't just Democrats voting against it. There were also 6 Republicans voting against it at the end of the day.
I was told, and this is, I think, interesting because the political effort behind this, they want to change both the Attorney General, Secretary of State, and now also university boards. The primary impetus here was for changing Attorney General and Secretary of State. But the departure of Kevin Guskiewicz, the MSU president, because of board infighting in large part, at least that was what he attributed his departure to, despite a $1 million raise, has put some fuel on the fire here. Michigan's an outlier in sort of having a political and public election for these instead of gubernatorial appointments. And so part of the impetus here is they want to make this a gubernatorial appointment, increase the executive power, and then hopefully, I think the aim here is to take some of the politics out of power, and then there's a certain faith that if governors are appointing these positions, that they could sort of play more nicely together and there'd be less dysfunction in these bodies.
Well, and that there would be just a better vetting process. And when we're talking about these things, we should just point out for the people who are playing along at home that the Attorney General, Secretary of State portion of it was to put that into a primary election.
Closed primary election.
Okay, but
that was critical for the Republicans.
Voters would have a choice on that and then take the university boards, the big 3 university boards, and make those an appointment system, again, with the idea that maybe it would be less of a cluster and that they would be better vetted by the governor's office and the governor's team than by party conventions.
I just want to underscore how much of an outlier Michigan is on the university boards. I think we're one of the only states, if not the only one, who elects university trustees in this manner. And so the gubernatorial appointment would put Michigan more in line. There are some states that do regional elections for
the legislature.
Some legislature.
That would be fun.
There are options.
And there'd be advice and consent.
But part of the problem is that it's very difficult to change, as we saw with this debate. It's one of those things that it's one of those weird Michigan quirks that is going to be really hard to extricate.
And I think what was on display Wednesdays, this was motivated by dysfunction on those university boards, but there's also a good bit of dysfunction in the legislature right now, and it's not functioning the way it should be in terms of getting policy that most people agree on across the finish line, in part because of politics. And now that they've missed that window to put it on the August ballot, I just don't see there being a will to put it on the November ballot so close to an election.
John Engler called after the vote and said, Timmy, we're going to shoot for November. And I say, well, good luck, Governor. You can do anything you want. This does give them more time, but let's not lose sight of the fact of why was the August date so important to Messieurs Engler, Blanchard, and supposedly the governor who did endorse this, right?
Well, yeah, I think one of the elements is that you're going to have university board candidates on the ballot in November. So if you pass something in November saying they can only serve through December or they don't get to serve at all, you're going to have a real problem. So I think one of the reasons was they were trying to give them some forewarning that your November election might be meaningless.
It would have increased the consequence, too, of November's gubernatorial election, because if this passed in August, one of the provisions here is that the slates of these university boards are essentially wiped clean, if I recall correctly, in early 2027.
All of them, yeah.
All of the members are removed. And then it gives the governor then the time to sort of craft these boards as they see fit.
And the new governor as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, half of it would be the current governor, Gretchen Whitmer, and then the other half would be the next governor. But yeah, and it does create an interesting dynamic. And just also doing it in August would have been in so many ways just a cleaner resolution to this.
Well, fewer voters, less competition with other issues, and probably less money to try to sell it if there had been any money at all. I think they were looking and hoping that the people would understand, but the people don't know anything about this process, do they?
It's really complicated. And, I think the issue of the Attorney General and Secretary of State for this election cycle anyway, if they'd had this conversation before they were selected at the party conventions, you could have made a case to voters, hey, if you do this in the future, you can have more of a say in who is your nominee. With the university boards of trustees, those are very regional issues. It's sometimes, like with the MSU president's departure, every once in a while it becomes an issue, but it's not something that the average voter cares about much.
It appeared
Although
to
I
me
think that part of the message here is we no longer like having party conventions picking these candidates as opposed to doing something, maybe anything else.
Was the speaker singing out of two different hymnals on this thing? It seems the signals out of the island last week were completely different than the stuff we saw on the floor. Que pasa there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. On the island, Hall, in an interview with us, was advocating for closed primaries, for AG and SOS in those primaries, for changes to the State Board of Education, to bring the state superintendent underneath the governor, and for university boards. What they narrowed it down to on Wednesday was just the university boards. When I asked him why all of that was left off, he said, we don't have a lot of time. This is what we think we can get across, and this is it.
Plus
And he also said now that the August ballot has failed, all of those other things are back on the table.
Yeah, and the MEA checked in and said they didn't like taking away power from the state board and the state superintendent, which caused some Democrats to take a hike. So this thing was sort of on a disaster trip from the get-go, but at least they put it up for a vote and fell, what, about 30 votes short? Yeah, okay, all right.
If that's what we're celebrating these days,
All right, let's talk about the statement from Governor Whitmer this week, vis-a-vis all the speculation in our town about maybe the presidency at MSU. Let's take a look at that story behind the story. One thing for sure, political correspondents just love to speculate.
Mike Duggan, U of M president. Big Gretch, MSU president.
There you go. Problem solved. Next story.
Now we can go home.
One could certainly make a strong case for Governor Gretchen Whitmer going back home to the campus of MSU, where she is an alum, to become the new president of the university. However, her office reports, quote, the governor does not have an interest in that position. In fact, the governor explains here that it would be wrong for her to be discussing anything about her future after she leaves office.
I don't think that that's appropriate. I am governor through the end of the year. I don't want to do anything that would could raise any sort of a conflict.
But remember, this governor said she had no interest in running for vice president. But if President Joe Biden had offered her the job, she would have taken it. Some would say so much for not being interested. Which brings us to the former independent candidate for governor, Mike Duggan, and the vacancy in the presidency at the U of M. He holds 2 degrees from that university, and Mark Bernstein is chair of the U of M board and supported Mr. Duggan for governor. And then there's Stephen Ross, a major contributor to the U of M, and this pundit says, what if Mr. Ross does this?
Ross, a contributor, a big backer of Duggan. If he wants Duggan in there as president, he's got a lot of money, and he's already given a lot of money to University of Michigan. He could make it happen all by himself.
Asked about his own future at his farewell news conference dropping out of the governor's race, Mr. Duggan indicated he had given no thought to anything. And 5 days later on Mackinac Island, when asked about the U of M presidency specifically, he never answered the question.
Over the next month or two, I'll assess what I do next.
Which, of course, will only serve to feed the speculation machine even more. As for the governor's lack of interest in the MSU gig, she has also said in the past you should say never about any job, which she didn't in this case.
So, boys and
Tim, I
girls.
look back at that montage, and how many suits do you own?
2 on a good day. And this
this
one has to be back by 3 o'clock. So let's talk fast, okay? Look at when I say I'm not interested, is that the same as saying I will not take this job, kids?
That is not the same.
You agree? Do we agree around the table on or not?
I think it's the same as saying never say never. It's a platitude, effectively, that says I'm not going to say no to anything, but I'm not going to say yes either. It's
so why does she say I'm not interested?
Well, I mean, look at what's happened over the past several years. The board infighting has, announced the departure of 2 higher education administrators. Like, I think the important thing to note in all this is that universities are pretty Byzantine institutions. Generally, like if you're looking for a high-demand president, usually they're from academia and they have some experience in higher education administration. The speculation doesn't involve folks that have that background.
Running the
that have board management, that have those sorts of skills.
What's the difference between that and wait a minute? What's the difference between that and running state government? Please, the university's got a football team. Okay.
From a strategic and political perspective, the governor has publicly avoided discussing her post-gubernatorial future, and I think that is similar in this case.
She could have said that.
Well, she could have. She could have.
Well, no, she didn't.
Yeah, she said that it was too early for her to talk about what she was going to do next.
Well, yes, but that was done long before this MSU story raised its head.
I don't think that that's changed.
I also think that, to Simon's point, it is one of those jobs that is very, very, very difficult. We've also seen a former governor try that job and not stay for very long. So it is very clearly a job that requires someone who is, to your point, actually capable of working with a lot of very complex personalities.
Tim, when you look at the level of dysfunction on the board of Michigan State in particular, but the other 2 ones as well, I mean, the question is, what rational person would want that? I mean, wanting the job is almost automatically disqualifying.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's the consternation that you're seeing. There was an interlude at the Mackinac Policy Conference where the Sandy Barua and the chair of the conference came out and they sort of gave this special address where they were sort of saying something's got to change on these university boards. These are big economic drivers, like it or not, these major research institutions, and they're concerned about sort of the instability on the board. And so you are, taking on a task that is a university in turmoil administratively. And I don't know if that's a great second act if you're coming.
And not a lot of power to manage it.
No.
Well, why not?
Because you've got to deal with an elected board that there's no real control over them. Also, you look at all of the departments, all of the faculty, all of the staff, that there are unions, that there are associations, that there is the internal politics, as someone else said, is Byzantine times 20.
Well, the way you describe it, nobody could do this job.
I mean, right now, I think that's the problem.
Well, the fear is that with each successive president's departure, it's increasingly less appealing.
And I also think they have had a couple of good presidents, and one's probably capable of doing that. But when you have a board second-guessing every decision you make, I mean, that's basically what Guskowitz came out with at the end of it, that it was impossible to move forward. So as long as that structure is in place, and I will say this, there are no guarantees that gubernatorial appointees will be any better behaved than elected officials. But, I don't know. I mean, the dynamic right now is pretty awful as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of faith with the gubernatorial appointment process that there's not going to be cronyism in this appointment process, and that a governor is going to take sort of an enlightened stance, right, and pick somebody who's a good administrator and is going to be above partisan politics.
Not just somebody who's a party hack.
Yeah, and that's taking a lot on faith, but it's sort of a belief that we could have better angels persevere.
I do think that clearing the board entirely and leaving it up to one governor would be looked at as a difficult political situation. I think in a lot of other states there is that gradual of, if somebody leaves or a certain term is over, then that appointment comes in, and it could change as the governorship changes. So that's another factor as well that should be considered.
Let me just expand on my political hack thing, because that's one of the criticisms from some of the watchers of government, that if you want to get a nice, cushy job, you go to the party convention and you've paid your dues as a Democrat or Republican, and you can get that. All right, so that's where that criticism comes from. Obviously, the people that are appointed have qualifications, and the convention can make the decision, and in these cases they have.
But when the convention is doing it, where does the responsibility fall? What individual group, what face gets put to the problems that were created? When you've got one person making the appointment, sure, is cronyism a potential hazard? Absolutely. But also that person is going to be vetted, there are staff people who have an interest in making sure that the person making the appointment, the governor, is not embarrassed by that appointment.
Look, I'm going to think there's going to be some people, donors, loyal MSU people, that are going to go to the governor at some point and say, look, for the good of the university, we need to have you in there. Do it for a year. Just put the ship back together again, then do whatever you want to do, but give one for the Gipper here. We need you because your leadership is strong. You can go in and take control. And does she turn her ear to that? Assuming that it's done. First of all, do you think it'll happen? Yay or nay?
I mean, that's above my pay grade.
No, it's not. No, Rick, nothing's above your pay grade.
A lot of things are. I mean, what Gretchen Whitmer is and ought to be looking at is this an accomplishable mission. Now, you could argue, she did it when she was named the Ingham County prosecutor following a scandal. So, I mean, it may be in her wheelhouse, but it's a job that you're taking to exit.
Well, and there's nothing, that would be the agreement. Just help us get over this hump and get the thing back on the track, and then you go ahead and do whatever you want.
I think that's the pitch they made to Engler, too.
Right.
And that didn't end well.
And he was pretty consistently miserable, I think, throughout his short tenure at Michigan State.
There's one other point.
Yeah, but put it in the context of what was going on.
Yes.
Okay, this was not a walk through the park.
Yeah,
well, this isn't a walk in the park either.
There's one other point I want to quickly make about this, and that is voters have a hard time holding the board accountable as well. Yes, they do elect them, but in the past, when voters have been interested, especially during the Larry Nassar situation, in recalling certain members of the Board of Trustees, it's essentially an impossible task because you need to issue a statewide recall for a university board position. So there's really not a lot of accountability there, except when they come up for those terms.
Right. And the fact that they're coattail candidates, effectively.
Right.
It really has to do with national political environment a lot more that's determining these days the makeup of that board because voters aren't paying attention.
There's no face that people relate responsibility to.
Right.
All right, you guys were all up on the island. Give me the lead story that came out of that little confab last week. Exactly.
I will say the U.S. Senate debate was interesting. We heard a lot from those candidates at a statewide level. They've done forums in the past, so it was very interesting to hear them on that stage. So I would say that's probably the most interesting thing to me.
Yeah. I mean, there was a gubernatorial forum. I mean, I moderated it, so obviously it was of
brilliant.
interest to me.
Right.
Yeah. Well, also, it was the day before the Board of State Canvassers decided who was going to be on the ballot. And so a fair number of people who were part of the event were not going to be an option come primary time.
Who all sat on that stage?
Oh, goodness. Well, it was Benson and Swanson, Nesbitt, James, Reband,
Mike Cox.
Mike Cox.
No Perry Johnson.
Perry Johnson as well.
Perry Johnson.
Perry Johnson. Well, so you had pretty good.
Yeah, no, it was. It was.
All right. So who's shy? Who was the winner out of that?
I mean, it was basically it was one-on-one interviews, and so
Wait a minute. So it wasn't a debate.
It wasn't a debate per se. No, it was one-on-one interviews because it was decided that might be, considering the numbers, a more effective forum. And you know, I mean, people got up, they answered questions, and they answered them fairly candidly.
Why do you suppose they didn't want to have everybody on the stage?
Well, there was an 11th hour attempt to have a two-person debate between John James and Jocelyn Benson, and John James, when this invitation went out, immediately accepted. And then Jocelyn Benson, who had to follow up after him, was like, I don't think, she basically declined the debate, and sort of a repeat of what we saw in the Democratic primary, proposed debate in Fox 2 this week.
And to John James, why wouldn't you? I mean, you know, you've still got a crowded primary where, you know, there are multiple possibilities. And if you're Jocelyn Benson, the, you know, de facto nominee, why would you when you don't know who you're going to be facing, you know, in November yet?
Beth, what was your lead?
I think what stuck out to me most about the Mackinac Conference, you know, the theme was common ground, but most of the time they were discussing this theme of the house is on fire and all of the problems that are happening in Michigan, and the fact that they think not enough people are paying attention to that. And it seemed like they were shouting kind of on deaf ears, because you know, they were citing statistics about education and income and everything, and just to flame that fire at the same time the MSU president was leaving, and because of consistent dysfunction on that board. So I think it seemed like a different tone from the chamber in that sense. Like, I've never heard them have such a negative message about the state of the state at that point. And I don't know that it's going to change any minds or any politics in this town, but it was an interesting theme all the same.
I also think it's hard to argue a common ground message when it's an election year. All of these people are running against each other in November, so there's not a lot of common ground right now.
But what better time to say that?
That gathering operates at its best when the state is facing a singular problem that requires the you know, the power players, the politicians, the business, the not-for-profits, to find a way to come together. You know, like you know, when the city of Detroit.
The Selfridge thing was a perfect example.
But and it happened, although I don't think it was as marquee as, say, you know, the city of Detroit facing bankruptcy.
Yeah, one of the things that stood out to me at the conference, and I reported on this as well, was sort of, there's always a bifurcation at the conference between the public side and the private side. You know, the conference exists to try to
the inside
bring
game
these
and the
two,
outside game.
Yes, they want to bring them together, meld them, and get them on the same page. That's like the goal. But there was a lot of discussion about artificial intelligence and data centers at this conference. And you could not hear from elected officials and the business representatives, two groups that were further apart. We had two members of the Ricolta family on two data center panels, and they were talking about how Michigan is going to miss the boat on this, and that if they could have their way in government and sort of crafting policy, they'd open up and do everything possible to accommodate these data centers. They stand to make a lot of money from them. They talked about opening up the waters of the Great Lakes for cooling. This was one suggestion from J.R. Ricolta. But when you talk to elected officials on the island, they were, you know, sort of representing perhaps a tide of public sentiment that is turning away from these things.
Well, the governor took an earful this week, didn't she, when she cozied up to the guys from the AI field? Did she not?
Yep, she did, and basically ran into the same problem that you know, the businesses that are pushing it in the island. And I mean, one of the things about the data center discussions on the island is a lot of the parties that are holding it up downstate just weren't there to provide the counterpoint. And so basically, in a sense, they were negotiating with themselves on that particular question.
Well, and her point was, if we don't do it, other states will, and we lose.
I think the message that you have to get across if you are in support of data centers is to address the concerns that the public has about affordability and access and environmental issues. If there's a way to message the data center issue, you have to address those points. A lot of people are very concerned that this is going to make their electric bills go up, that there might be brownouts.
Isn't there a provision that can't happen?
There is, but I think there's still a lot of concern about that.
In other words, they don't believe the provision.
Well, I mean, look at who they're dealing with: the Michigan Public Service Commission, and Consumers Energy and DTE, all of whom have record low, trust issues right now with the public. And so I think there is a little bit of hesitance there. Hesitance is a light word to explain what some of the opposition towards this, but it's I think for some of the utilities, they've made their bed and now they're lying in it.
Well, the Public Service Commission created part of its own problem by going around the normal process to vet this thing. And so, well, let's speed it. The utility said, let's speed it up, and the PSC said, sure, let's do that. And the publics go, whoa, wait a second, that train's leaving the station.
I mean, the plan here is to muscle through a resolution and then figure out that the public will get on board after the fact.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the bottom line is that you can say that it's not going to raise rates, it's going to have no impact on electricity, but then as you're building a 700-acre data center, I believe, in Saline, and then the utility who's going to be servicing that then applies for a $500 million rate increase again for, I think, how many times in the past couple of years? Half a dozen, perhaps? Then I don't think that your pledge to not increase rates kind of rings hollow.
So what about the legislative proposal that says, let's just hit the pause button for a year and take a deep breath and come back?
That just delays it, doesn't it?
I mean, and that gets to the missing the boat problem.
It just delays the debate that needs to happen. And I think a lot of the concern is that it wasn't happening, that it's getting sped up and there's not a lot of public scrutiny. And that is part of the problem with the trust.
And I think part of the difficulty here is that when you talk to the elected officials who are not saying no on data centers, but that they want a more robust regulatory framework, they want to see like community benefit agreement requirements in some of these facilities, those conversations aren't happening right now.
I talked to a local consultant in town who's been hired by the utilities and the data center people, and he said, here's their major problem. They send in all the wonks, the people that don't speak the people's language. He says, what they need to do is go in and tell the people how this benefits you. Do you have a cell phone? Do you use Amazon? All of this stuff is going to provide you power. Lay it on the line. Be truthful.
But that argument is out there, and it
but
keeps
his point was it
over
was
and over and over again. Like it's not working.
I hear music in the background, which means it's time for me to take my suits back, and also thank you for being here. Where would that come from, Ricky? Thank you. Thank you all for showing up. We'll see you next week for more Off the Record, okay?
Production of Off the Record is made possible in part by Bellwether Public Relations, a full-service strategic communications agency partnering with clients through public relations, digital marketing, and issue advocacy. Learn more at bellwetherpr.com. For more Off the Record, visit WKAR.org. Michigan Public Television stations have contributed to the production costs of Off the Record.